Eric Schoenfeld here with TechCrunch, and I've got Navarrow Wright, my guest today, CTO of Interactive One, which runs many sites, including Black Planet. You were also a founder of the Global Grind, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
The studio. We wanted to talk about a topic that's been in the news lately, sort of diversity or the lack of diversity in Silicon Valley and the tech companies. And this sort of came to the fore recently. Soledad O'Brien had a show on diversity and actually had Michael Arrington, founder of TechCrunch, on there. And she had him what I thought was sort of a gotcha moment that really went viral across the web, saying that he couldn't think of a black entrepreneur at the moment.
Right.
And I kind of think that took away from sort of the bigger, the bigger issue that I thought the documentary was trying to address, which was this issue of, is there a diversity problem in Silicon Valley, which is why I wanted to talk to you about that. So is there a problem?
So I definitely think there is a problem, and I agree with you. I think the comments that Michael made in the viral storm took away from the goal of the documentary, which was to show, hey, there is a disparity amongst the startup ecosystem around African Americans specifically, and their creating of startups, right? There's a study out there that said less than 1% of startups were started by African American entrepreneurs. So that's a pretty glaring statistic. And what the documentary wanted to show was a groundbreaking accelerator created by a woman named Angela Benton, which took 8 African American entrepreneurs into the Valley to learn that ecosystem and accelerate the growth of their products. And in that, making people understand twofold. On the minority side, that, hey, you can take advantage of this opportunity. This opportunity is a pretty large one. Mm-hmm. And on the Valley side, hey, if we open ourselves up to kind of new audiences and new perspectives, there could be a new crop of entrepreneurs to enter that ecosystem.
So I think there is a sense in Silicon Valley that Silicon Valley is a meritocracy. And in many cases, it is a meritocracy, and people believe that. There may be conscious or unconscious biases, but for the most part, if you have ability, you can succeed there. So that's the belief. So I want to know if you agree with that. But more so, if that's true, why do you need separate incubators, for minorities? Aren't there enough incubators already with things like Y Combinator and 500 Startups and Techstars and Founder Institute? Why isn't that sort of a platform for them to start the companies?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question first. I think it is a meritocracy at some levels. And from my own personal experience in launching Global Grind in the Valley, that once being a part of that ecosystem, I met some of the smartest, most innovative people I've ever met in my life, and they've still affected me to this day. I think the challenge is, how do you get involved in that ecosystem, right? And secondly, goes to your accelerator and incubator question. There is, as we both know, there's a certain process in how you create startups and how you become into that ecosystem. And when you're coming from demographic groups that don't have a lot of examples of that in their environment, you don't really necessarily have the beginning steps to get into that accelerator. So let's take any of those leading accelerators. There's a certain assumption that you know how to build your product, you understand the landscape, you know all the different steps, and you just need guidance, right? I think the reason why we need some of these other accelerators to focus on specific groups is to help them understand that process so that they're better equipped, right? And then the secondary byproduct of that is that the more minority entrepreneurs you have, the next generation can say, hey, that person looks like me, it's an attainable opportunity, what do I need to do? So I think that it bridges those two gaps.
So what are the main barriers to getting more minorities to be involved in startups? Is it that they're being blocked by the holders of the keys, to power in Silicon Valley? Or is it that not enough minorities even pursue these opportunities in the first place?
I think it's a little bit of both. So I think there's a perception problem in the minority community. And that perception is that it's easier to become an entertainer and an athlete than it is to become an entrepreneur. And while both industries have challenges, the barriers, as we both know in the technology perspective, are lower today than they've ever been. Mm-hmm. So changing that perception and saying, hey, you have an iPhone, but you can build things on an iPhone versus just using it, that consumer versus consumption mentality, if we can change that, that's one. On the Valley side, I do believe that there's opportunities that, the Valley is always looking at new markets. They're looking in Asia, they're looking in other continents, et cetera. That if we took some of the brightest people from the Valley and urban centers and said, hey, these are the opportunities there and this is how you do them, they could substantiate and create that growth, when it doesn't exist now. So I do believe opening that dialogue, and I think the fear is no one wants to have the race conversation for the same reason that when Michael Arrington's clip came out, no one wants to be labeled a racist, right? So I think we need to get past that and focus on, hey, for the good of the country, right? We need as many diverse ideas and we need as economic growth from as many different places as possible. How can we cultivate that in places that we aren't? And I think that's core to the Valley. I think understanding and opening perception that if we focus on certain areas within our own country, you could create a whole new crop.
So do you think that that different minority groups should be treated as different markets, like we treat Japan as a market and India as a market? We should treat Hispanics and blacks as different markets?
Well, I think to a certain degree, I think, from a perspective of you're going to those new markets to find new growth and new ideas, right? So if you look at the history and say that there haven't been a lot of minority entrepreneurs, looking at that, well, what knowledge can we impart in that community to stimulate that growth? It's the same philosophy, but I think what you'll find is you'll find twofold, is you'll create a new crop of entrepreneurs and they in turn will create that ecosystem. I think the challenge we have is that in a lot of minority centers, that entrepreneurial ecosystem doesn't exist. And I think from a knowledge standpoint, we can create that.
Right. So Eric Ries did a great guest post on meritocracy and racism on TechCrunch, and he brought the example of blind screening in orchestras and how once orchestras had blind screenings where you couldn't see the gender or race of the person behind it. It went from this very white male dominated
Right.
Industry to at least on the gender side, a lot more women became parts of orchestras. And he advocated a similar sort of blind screening test for startups and for incubators, et cetera. What else, do you think, that sounds to me like a good idea, what else do you think Silicon Valley can do to break the diversity barrier?
No, so I think the blind screening is could be a possibility. I think anyone coming into a room, we all do, we make assumptions based on our knowledge or lack of knowledge, right? And those aren't necessarily malicious in nature, they're just assumptions. So they create a bias. So if the goal is at the end of the day is that I want to be recognized on my merit, regardless of what my background is. So I do think we need to figure out ways to do that. I think what the Valley can do is there's an education that needs to happen, right? Like I said, there are a lot of people out there who have ideas that aren't that great. They haven't taken them through the process, and them understanding the process, we either say, hey, this is for me, and they'll come the right way, or they'll say it's not for me. Because I'm not saying that if you go into an urban center with entrepreneurship that everyone should become entrepreneurs. What I'm saying is, by educating them on the process and educating them on the realms of possibility, they'll start thinking different, right? And I'm speaking from personal experience. I can honestly say, from coming out of the Valley and being connected to people like Jim Breyer and Dave Morin, that I think differently. And that kind of changes you in terms of how you solve problems in general. And I think minorities have some core abilities in terms of being entrepreneurial in nature that just haven't been availed to the technology space. And I think, we've talked about engineering education and all those different things. There's pieces to it, but that education of the opportunity is a good first step because it's all about the light at the end of the tunnel. If I'm deciding what career I'm going to go in and I understand where technology can take me, then I'd be more apt to want to learn that technology. Without those examples, it's just, why would I want to do it, right? And I think the Valley can help change that. If I could take a Dave McClure or a Fred Wilson to Howard and have those same conversations and the way that they're able to animate and inspire entrepreneurs today, they may animate people that otherwise never thought of that, who may have an idea in the back of their head that's life-changing. And that's what I really want to make sure that happens.
Right. Well, thank you for coming and talking about this.
No, thank you. I appreciate you for having me.